Daf Yomi, Tractate Menachot, page 12 today. Daf Yud Bet. And we're starting on the bottom of 11b for context. We started a new Mishnah on the bottom, last two lines of 11b. That's where I'll start from just for context. With regard to one who removes a handful from the meal offering with the intent to partake of its remainder outside the temple. So this is like the pigul version of minchas, of meal offerings. So if one who removes a handful from the meal offering with intent to partake of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, to burn its handful outside the temple courtyard, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful outside the temple courtyard, or to burn its frankincense outside the temple courtyard. In all these cases, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for a karet for one who partakes of it. If one had the intent to partake of its remainder on the next day, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder on the next day, to burn its handful on the next day, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful on the next day, or to burn its frankincense on the next day. Now we are on Menachot 12. Yud Beis Amid Aleph on the top of the word pigul. The offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive karet for partaking of the remainder of that meal offering. Zehaklal. This is the principle. Kol hakomet onotin nichli. Hamoy lechamachti lechol davar shidalko lechol laktil davar shidalko laktil. Chutz limikom pasul ve'en moy kores. Chutz lizmanoy pigul chayav of kores. U'ilvad shiyakiv hamati v'mitzvosoli. I like to read with that Israeli Litvish kind of pronunciation, because I visualize like a lot of the real like Panovich or Briskers, learning Kutchin. So I like to give that, that kind of pronunciation. It brings the flavor, that real Litvish flavor. This is the principle, and of course mixed with my own stuff too. I mean, they wouldn't read the English the way I'm reading it, but they would say, Ketzad korei hamatir ki mitzvosoi, kol matz beshtiko, no samich li hoilich vektir. It's like the Israeli Litvish, you know what I mean? I'm making it, you know what I'm talking about. Whoever knows. This is the principle. In the case of anyone who removes the handful or places the handful in the vessel, or who conveys the vessel with the handful to the altar, or who burns the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of an item, whose typical manner is such that one partakes of it, for example, the remainder, or to burn an item whose typical manner is such that one burns it on the altar, for example, the handful or the frankincense outside its designated area. The meal offering is unfit, but there is no liability for karet if his intent was to do so beyond its designated time. The offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive karet on account of it, provided that the permitting factor, meaning the handful, was sacrificed in accordance with his mitzvah. If the pertaining factor was not sacrificed in accordance with the mitzvah, although the meal offering is unfit, the prohibition of pigul does not apply to it. And going back to this, again, this is what I'm saying, this Litvish kind of pronunciation. Ketzad korei hamatir ki mitzvosoi. Kol mas b'shtika nosan nichli v'hoy v'hiktir chutz lizmanoi, hoy shekomatz chutz lizmanoi, v'nosan nichli v'hoy v'hiktir b'shtika, hoy shekomatz v'nosan nichli v'hoy v'hiktir chutz lizmanoi, zeu shekorei hamatir ki mitzvosoi. How is the permitting factor considered to have been sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah? If one removes the handful in silence, meaning with no specific intent, and placed in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder beyond its designated time, or if one removed the handful with the intent to partake of the burn the handful or frankincense beyond its designated time, and placed it in the vessel and conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar in silence with no specific intent, or if one removed the handful and placed in the vessel, conveyed it and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder beyond its designated time. That is the case of an offering whose permitting factor was sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah, and one is liable to receive karet for partaking of it due to pigul. Keitzad lo yikorav amatich mitzvah soi korav chutz limikoi moinasan mechlivoy lechviktir chutz izmanoi oy shekamat chutz izmanoi nasan mechlivoy lechviktir chutz izmikoi moi oy shekamat nasan mechlivoy lechviktir chutz limikoi moi zeo shelo yikorav amatir kemitzvah soi. How is the permitting factor not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah? If one removed the handful with the intent to partake of the remainder, or burn the handful or frankincense outside its designated area, or place it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder beyond its designated time, or if one removed the handful with the intent to partake of the remainder, or burn the handful or frankincense beyond its designated time, and placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder outside its designated area, or if one removed the handful and placed it in the vessel, and conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder outside its designated area. That is the case of an offering whose permitted factor was not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah. Minchas choite u'minchas kinois shekamatzan shelo yishman nasan mechlivoy lechviktir chutz izmanoi oy shekamatz chutz lizmanoi nasan mechlivoy lechviktir shelo yishman או שקמץ ונתן מechlivo לechviktir shelo lishman zehu shelo karav amatir kemitzvato. The meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy is brought by a sota, that one removed their handful not for their sake and placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar with the intent to partake of the remainder, or burned the handful beyond its designated time, or one that removed the handful with the intent to partake of the remainder, or burned the handful beyond its designated time, or placed it in the vessel, conveyed it, and burned the handful on the altar not for their sake, or that one removed the handful and placed it in the vessel, and conveyed it and burned the handful on the altar not for their sake. That is the case of an offering whose permitting factor was not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah. Lechol kazayis bechutz, kazayis l'macha, kazayis l'macha, kazayis bechutz. Kachatzizayis bechutz, kachatzizayis l'macha, kachatzizayis l'macha, kachatzizayis bechutz. Pasur ve'en moikoris. If one performed one of these rites with the intent to partake of an olive bulk outside its designated area, and an olive bulk the next day, or an olive bulk the next day and an olive bulk outside its designated area, or half an olive bulk outside its designated area and half an olive bulk the next day, or half an olive bulk the next day and half an olive bulk outside its designated area, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for karet. אמר רבי יהודה, זה הכלל, אם מחשבת הזמן קודמה למחשבת המקום פיגול, וחייבן עולב קורס, אם מחשבת המקום קודמה למחשבת הזמן, פסול ואין בוי קורס. וחכמים אומרים, זה וזה פסול ואין בוי קורס. Rabbi Yehuda says that this is the principle, that the intent with regard to the time preceded the intent with regard to the area. The offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive karet on account of it. If the intent with regard to the area preceded the intent with regard to the time, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for karet. And the rabbis say, in both this case, where the intent with regard to time was first. In that case, where the intent with regard to area came first, the offering is unfit, but there is no liability for karet. That's the Mishnah, folks. We proceed to the Talmud. Zok the Heilige Talmud. The Gemara says a dilemma was raised before the sages. According to the statement of the one who says that if the remainder of a meal offering became lacking between the removal of the handful and the burning of the handful on the altar, the priest nevertheless burns the handful on account of such a meal offering. And as we maintain that despite the fact that the handful is burned on account of that remainder is prohibited for consumption, what is the halacha with regard to pigul? Should the burning of the handful be effective in establishing such a remainder as pigul when the handful was burned with the intent to partake of the remainder the next day? And similarly, is the burning of the handful effective in removing such remainder from being subject to misuse of consecrated property, just as a complete remainder is removed, being subject to this prohibition after the burning of the handful when it becomes permitted to the priests for consumption? Rav Huna said, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says that the sprinkling of the blood of an offering which renders its meat permitted for consumption and removes it from being subject to misuse for consecrated property is effective in removing of the meat of an offering that left the temple courtyard from being subject to misuse of consecrated property, despite the fact that such meat is prohibited for consumption, that the statement applies only when the meat was disqualified by means of leaving. Rav Huna explains the reason is that the meat remains as is, and the disqualification of the meat by means of leaving is on account of something else. In other words, a factor external to the meat itself. But in the case of a lack in the measure of the remainder of a meal offering, which is a disqualification on account of itself, the burning of the handful is not effective in removing the remainder from being subject to misuse of consecrated property, nor to establish it as pigul. Rava said to Rav Huna, on the contrary, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that sprinkling is not effective in removing the meat that left the temple courtyard from being subject to misuse of consecrated property, that statement applies only when the meat was disqualified by means of leaving, as the meat is not inside the temple courtyard where the sprinkling could be effective for it. But with regard to a lack in the measure of the remainder of a meal offering that is inside the temple courtyard, the burning of the handful is effective in removing the remainder from being subject to misuse of consecrated property, as well as in establishing it as pigul. Amarave bino aminole. Itnan akomet et mincha. Lekol shirei b'chutz u'kezayis b'shirei b'chutz. V'tani v'yarbechia akomet et mincha. L'tani o kezayis. Rabbah said, from where do I say that even remainders that lack a full measure can be rendered pigul? This can be inferred from that which we learned in the Mishnah. With regard to one who removes a handful from the meal offering with intent to partake of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, or to partake of an all bulk of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, the meal offering is unfit but there is no liability for karet. And if he removes a handful from the meal offering with intent to partake of its remainder beyond the designated time, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder beyond the designated time, the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive karet for partaking of the remainder of that meal offering. And Rabbi Chia teaches in his version of the Mishnah, one who removes a handful from the meal offering with the intent to partake of its remainder, and he does not teach, or an olive bulk of its remainder. My taima lo tani okezais lav kigon shechasru shirayim lekamulo akezais kevan divmatan kli behiluch uvehaktore lo misnele. Rava continues, what is the reason that Rabbi Chia diverged from the standard text of the Mishnah and did not teach or an olive bulk? Is it not because his Mishnah is discussing a case where the remainder later became lacking and its measure stood at an olive bulk? And therefore Rabbi Chia did not include the clause or an olive bulk, since later in the Mishnah, with regard to the placement of the handful in a vessel, and with regard to the conveyance of the vessel to the altar, and with regard to the burning of the handful, he could not teach the phrase. Now we turn to 12b, because it's just no idea, to the phrase Okazayas Shirayim B'Kmitza Naminechol Shirayim Notani Okazayas Katani Sefer Pigul V'Chayav V'Navkais Alam V'Hayin Lagatam. He could not teach the phrase or an olive bulk in the case of one's intent with regard to the consumption, we're on 12b now, of the remainder, because the remainder is already the size of an olive bulk. Therefore, in the case of the removal of the handful as well, meaning when he teaches one who removes a handful to partake of its remainder, Rabbi Chia did not teach or to consume an olive bulk of its remainder, despite the fact that he could have done so in that clause. Rava concludes his proof, and yet the latter clause teaches that if one burned the handful with the intent to consume the remainder after its designated time, the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive karet on account of it. Evidently, burning is effective in rendering a lacking remainder as pigul. Stop here and continue on, Mr. Shem, with the next amud.